like such amount of friends who just friends and so like super sad at the Jordan and I felt so sad. He must have been.
If we can make sure that everyone's muted, I'm hearing someone's private conversation. Just gonna give it another minute before we start. All right, let's go ahead. Oh, the recording is on. All right, let's go ahead and get started. So I'm going to call this third work session to order on the alcohol tax. Let's go ahead and start with a roll call of assembly members.
Yes, Mr. Chair. Mr. Rivera.
Present.
Ms. Quinn Davidson. Ms. Allard. Mr. Constant. Mr. Dunbar. Ms. Kennedy.
Here.
Ms. LaFrance.
Here.
Mr. Peterson.
Present.
Mr. Perez-Verdia.
Here.
Mr. Weddleton.
Here.
Ms. Salatal. You have a quorum, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. So as usual, if members want to get in the queue, please put yourself in the chat. If you can't access the chat, just text me. Also, seeing as this is a back and forth dialogue between the Assembly and Recover and the Coalition, if Recover or Coalition members want to get in the chat as well, and put yourself in the queue, that would be great. So just a little bit of laying the framework before I turn it over to Tiffany Hall, and then we will get started. So as I described in an email to the members, which you received late last night, these meetings are meant to do three things. First, to foster additional dialogue with our community partners. Two, to answer any questions Assembly members may have for our community partners, especially if they have provided us with specific proposals, which Recover and the Community Coalition have. And three, for our community partners to ask us any questions. So this is the first of a series of meetings that we're going to have through the end of the month. So we'll be repeating this same dialogue with different community partners. So with that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Tiffany.
Hi there. Thanks very much, Chair Rivera, and I'm sorry that my camera is not working today. And actually, in the spirit of collaboration, and because you all have heard from me a couple of times, I'm going to pass the mic to my kind of fellow leaders on this work, and recognize that we have a lot of other partners on the phone. So they will just give a very brief kind of introduction to some of the ideas around this work. And then we are really looking forward to hearing your questions and to hearing from some of our other participants. So I'm going to actually turn it over to Thea, and sorry, Chair Rivera, that I didn't let you know ahead of time this was what I would be doing.
Fair enough. Go ahead, Thea.
Great. Thank you so much, Tiffany. And thank you, Chairperson Rivera, and thank you so much to all the Assembly members. I know this has been a very intense and in-depth, and you're taking a lot of time with this process, and I think we all really appreciate that and kind of can imagine the impact that's having on you personally and professionally. So we just really appreciate that you're taking the time. So we've gotten to have a number of different opportunities to present the work that this group has pulled together over the last 6 weeks or so. So our goal today really, like you said, is not to go through that again. We'd love to do exactly what you just said, engage in that kind of dialogue and answer questions and hear questions from the folks that are there today. We just wanted to touch on a couple of things that we think are really critical for the framework that this group has put together. And I'm going to talk just a couple minutes, and then Trevor is going to speak a little bit, and then Dick Monsager, I think he's on the line as well, might add, and then we're just hand it back to you to facilitate the group. First of all, just to maybe reinforce a little bit why we thought it was important to put a theory of change together. And, you know, we are really seeing the issues that the alcohol tax is focused on addressing as population level public health issues. So we don't see these as results of individual actions or anything of that nature. We really see these as public health issues. And I think the reason for that is that all the people that are engaged with this coalition and Recover and the folks that are leading the charge on this, we're all very familiar with the persistence of the data. So we know that in all of the issues that the alcohol tax is seeking to make change, we know there are longstanding racial disparities, there are disparities in terms of income levels, and it's not these are not uncommon problems. These are things that exist in other communities around the country, in other countries, and there are well-known and well kind of tested solutions to them. So the reason we really wanted to put the framework together was to put down on paper, kind of in one place, for all of us to process and debate and then hopefully come to agreement on what is our overall sequence of activities that we believe needs to be put in place. What are the short and medium term outcomes that we hope will be achieved by those in order to really get to those long-term outcomes that we've identified. And we believe that those long-term outcomes, and right now there's 10 of them on the logic model, those are really ways of defining what we mean when we say safety and well-being for all in Anchorage. So that's one thing I wanted to share, is just kind of why we have a framework, why that's important to us. So it's not just about funding projects here and there. It's about putting into action a cohesive and sustained set of activities that will take us to the outcomes that we're seeking. And I think when you're all very familiar with the Anchored Home Plan, the Anchored Home Plan takes the same approach to addressing homelessness. So the vision for that, as you know, is that homelessness in Anchorage is rare, brief, and one time. That's a pretty clear and measurable outcome. And the activities that are in the plan are meant to take us there. And all the work that Jasmine and the coalition and all those partners are doing to make sure we have the data to measure that along the way, we're seeking the same approach here with the funding that our community's making available through the alcohol tax. So just one other thing I want to emphasize about the framework is that, again, kind of in keeping with this public health approach, we talk about prevention in 3 levels. We talk about primary, secondary, and tertiary. And I want to start by talking about the tertiary level. So tertiary, it's third, it's the highest level. And that really is activities that you would engage in to address people who are in crisis right now. So those are the people that we know who are camping in the woods, people who are in crisis because of domestic violence, children who are suffering, people with behavioral health that don't have treatment. So those are the folks that we see in our emergency departments. We see them on the street. We know they need help right now. So of course we need to put resources towards those folks. And of course we can improve how we address that moment of crisis so that we can connect them to long-term supports and hopefully reduce the crisis and get them back into a more safe and healthy way of living, and a way of living that's healthier for our community as well. But if we only focus on that end, as we all know, we won't change the number of people who are entering into that tertiary level over time. So that's why we've also identified those primary prevention activities, and those are activities that are good for every single person in our community. So primary prevention is a universal approach. It looks at every single person and says, what can we do that's good for everyone? And then that secondary level is kind of the in-between. Those are the activities that are addressing people who are at risk for the issues that we're trying to address. And we can see that they're starting to get to that point where they might end up in that crisis. And so we want to address some specific activities towards them. So when we look at this whole framework, I guess the parts I really want to emphasize is that we're really serious about trying to get to those long-term outcomes. Because if we can achieve that, we actually will have made Anchorage a safe and healthy place for everyone here. And not to say we'll never have any problems again, but we will have made a huge measurable difference. And then because we want to get to that point, we know we have to do work for people in crisis and people who are at risk of crisis, but also for everyone in our community. So I guess overall, I want to just emphasize that the purpose of the framework is really to give you a roadmap, to give all of us a roadmap, and to help us see the points along the way so that we can measure whether we're getting where we're trying to go. And then also that if we were to implement this, our goal is really that this makes our community better for everyone. And I know that you're hearing a lot of testimony where people are kind of saying, I don't want what I have to go towards those other people. And I guess our approach here is that if we invest in our community and if we invest in people who are suffering, that our community will be better for all of us. And actually over time, we will be able to spend our money on better things and spend less money on dealing with crisis and kind of short-term fixes. So with that, I want to hand it over to Trevor, who can really speak even more to the importance of primary prevention and just prevention overall. So Trevor, I'll hand it over to you. And thank you again for having us with you today.
Thank you, Thea. Just doing a mic check.
You're a little soft, Trevor.
Well, you would be the first one to ever say that to me, Felix. Is this better?
Yeah, you're still a little bit soft volume-wise. I wouldn't say anything otherwise, Trevor.
I'm not sure why, but I will just speak up and hopefully you
Yeah,
can
that
all
works.
hear.
Thanks.
Fabulous. Well, and I've talked about primary prevention before, but I want to use this analogy I think most of us here in Alaska can relate to, and that is the idea of a leaky pipe. So at times you may be doing a home inspection. What is primary prevention? It's when you see a pipe that's starting to corrode, there's some wear and tear, and there could be some potential future damage if it's not addressed. And we all know the power and the destruction of a leaky pipe. So you go ahead, you get rid of the rust, you may paint that pipe, you may actually completely replace it. It could be a variety of interventions that you do that by doing that will save you a lot of headache, hardship, and cost in the future by doing that. And that's what primary prevention is. That is what we talk about when we go upstream, so far upstream, we prevent that glacier from ever melting. So we're actually preventing the pipe from ever leaking, or at least not leaking for some time. And that is the majority of the work that we have been talking about, and the importance of this investment and behind the philosophy that is behind the theory of change. By doing this, we know that we are putting in place necessary steps that we can prevent not just child abuse, but also exposure to domestic violence and other issues. And the idea of having the intervention within the police department, crisis now work, all of that is working up. But really the prevention stuff is happening in the child abuse and neglect with pre-K and so forth. So when these individuals, our next generation, grow up and become those contributing members to our community that we want, they are truly contributing at the highest level versus potentially being a deficit to our community. And that's where the next is, well, at times you don't always catch the pipe. As much as we do, it still may have a drip, and you start seeing that form. You can see it in the ceiling that something is leaking. You could ignore it, but we know what will happen. And that's where secondary, so damage has already occurred. There's an additional cost, but there's still work that can be done that does further prevention and lessening the impact that you could have. And those are the secondary. That is like some of the crisis now work. That is some of the work that we're talking about related to working with individuals that are victims of domestic violence or victims of child abuse and neglect. But there's still a greater cost if compared to catching it before that leak starts. And then the tertiary, that is when you come back home, you go downstairs, or you go into your crawl space here in Alaska, and you've got 6 feet of water. The flood has happened. You can't go back. The cost is enormous. Multiple people are impacted. There is a detriment to our community and to your home. Waiting until we intervene then. And that is, again, a big thing about this theory of change is we are not about the now. That is a piece of it. And we do need to still feed the line. You've heard me talk about that. But we really need to go in and inspect our pipes and start looking, where are they rusting? Where do we need to put in some new piping? Maybe replace the copper with better technology today, the pipe that allows to flex in the cold. So when mistakes are made, it doesn't result in a complete burst in our piping system. Things of that nature. When we do that kind of upstream work, we're not only ensuring the future of the next generation, but the generations after them. And for those in the room, it's not just always about the people, but we start investing our dollars not into tertiary and more police and more police and more police and security systems, but actually into the things that we all want, which could be the arts, our parks, having lower property taxes, things like that, versus always having to go back to the trough because we're only focused on the tertiary. Upstream saves time, money, and allows a greater investment in the things that we want versus the things that we don't. Thea, who's after me? Is that Dick?
Yes, if it's okay, Felix, I'd like to just make a couple minutes of comments. If we continued on with the metaphor that Trevor started about a pipe, as a white guy, I've really come to believe that racism is the corrosive agent for huge problems in our society. I've always thought I was reasonably aware and connected, but boy, this summer has really shown me how much I've really needed to examine myself, my own motivations, and think about what we do as society that has created situations that are so difficult for people who are discriminated against. As many of you know, I spent a whole bunch of my career working in Indian Health Service and could see the effects on our Native American populations. If any of you start your days like I do in the morning with NPR, you may have heard a 5-minute clip this morning with an interview with a single mom who's a teacher in Fort Defiance, Arizona, a Navajo member, who talked so eloquently about the effects of racism on her family and on growing up. So I guess as I think about racism and the way that you all allocate monies now, if I follow on Trevor's metaphor, we need to examine what can we do structurally to reduce the effect and help us lead, as Thea said, to be a healthier community in the years ahead. Meanwhile, we have to treat the effects of it too. So in the world I'm working in right now of homelessness, we have to deal with people who are in crisis now, and we can't ignore them. But we also, I would argue, need to continue, and you all have the opportunity to spend some of the money in thinking about what we can restructure, whether it's in governmental processes about how we do grants, whether it's about how we pay attention and make choices about who we partner with as the providers, how we on the philanthropy side, we need to examine our lives and say, how do we choose the organizations to which we make grants? Finally, I want to say thank you, because if I think about secondary prevention, what you all have done with some of the significant amount of CARES Act money to pay for rent and keep businesses afloat, that's really important, that we survive the time we're in and keep people out of homelessness, keep them in homes, keep their families together, structurally support the kids as much as possible as we go through a tough school year. So I just encourage you to think about this as a lens and to continue to think about Trevor's metaphor that I think is really helpful, to think about the corrosion that racism does to our society. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. So I appreciate Tiffany, Thea, Trevor, and Dick for getting this kicked off. Want to note for the record that we've been joined by Ms. Zolotel, Mr. Dunbar, and I believe Mr. Weddleton. I don't think you were there for the roll call. So with that, the remainder of our time, so I think we're scheduled until 2:30, so we have a little bit over an hour. This is open dialogue, so I'm going to just start off with the folks I see in the queue, and then if folks want to add themselves in the queue, feel free to. So Mr. Perez-Verdia.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm open to any one of the speakers addressing this question. After reviewing the theory of change, one of the questions that stands out to me is the alignment between what you've proposed and what the expectations of the community are in terms of what they voted for, and that clear alignment between this is what we said we were going to do and this is what we're proposing to do with it. And I'm hoping you can speak to that. The theory of change and the whole document is rather dense and complicated and has lots of levels to it. So maybe you can help us to understand clearly how this proposal directly aligns with what we said we were going to do and how we said we were going to do it. Thanks.
This is Thea. Chair Rivera, I could take a shot at that if you'd like.
Go ahead.
Great. Thanks for the question, Cameron. I think first I would just point to, just to recap, basically the alcohol tax that we all voted for had three main purposes. So first one, increasing community safety. So that refers to police, related criminal justice personnel, and first responders. The second is reducing and preventing child abuse, sexual assault, and domestic violence. And then the third is prevention and treatment of substance misuse, mental health issues, and homelessness. So with the group of people that came together, this very broad coalition, over 200 organizations and individuals, the goal there was really to pull together people who are experts in those areas. So people who are expert at understanding how to prevent and treat substance misuse, mental health, homelessness, child abuse, domestic violence, and improve community safety. And so what we did is first look at, well, what does that mean? If we're going to focus on that constellation of issues, what would it look like? How do we define what success would look like? So if you are looking at the logic model, those long-term outcomes on the right-hand side. There's 10 of them. The goal there is to really just break down those key purposes of the alcohol tax funding into some measurable outcomes. And so that's what those 10 items do for us is, there's, when you say I want to prevent child abuse, that's a topic that you can literally spend years. I've spent 20 something years now working with communities and with funders and trying to understand how do we do that. So there's no one way to prevent child abuse, because all of the issues that are targeted by the alcohol tax money all come from a kind of constellation of both individual and collective experiences. They're the results of a lot of different things coming together. So when you're trying to prevent them or change them, you have to address that whole constellation. So that list of 10 items on the right-hand side is an effort to define what that looks like if we achieve those purposes of the alcohol tax. So I think that's the simplest place to start. So to answer your question, all of the work that's in here is an effort to unpack and define what it looks like to do the things that are expressly identified in the statute, the authority for the alcohol tax. So this is really our answer to that question that's posed by, we have money, we have these three purposes in mind, what do we do with it? How do we use that money to affect those purposes? This is what that looks like. So, and it is complicated because all of the things that are mentioned in the alcohol tax ordinance are complicated problems, and they can't be fixed by one thing or one entity. They really have to be fixed by addressing that constellation of causes. And so that's what we've tried to do here with this framework.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, can I do one follow-up, please?
Yeah, go ahead.
Great. Well, I think, and I agree with everything you said, and I appreciate knowing that those 10 are directly related to the 3. And so it would be, I guess I would just, from a visual perspective and a communication perspective, would love to be able to see the 3 buckets connected to the 10 buckets, so that you could see bucket number 1 of what the expectation is addressed in numbers 1 through 4, and bucket number 2 is addressed through buckets 5 through 8 or whatever. Just so I can, because I think that you're right, it is complex. It's going to be very difficult to communicate this out to a broad audience, and so whatever tools we can have to communicate it clearly will be helpful. And so if there is a direct alignment between the 10 and the 3, that would be helpful. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thanks. And I think just to, so everyone's on the same page. So the document that both you, Thea, and Cameron, you were talking about was the Theory of Change Funding Framework?
Yes.
Okay, great. Yeah, we just got the members have a whole bunch of different documents. So as we're talking about the documents, let's just try to be clear so the members can follow along over the phone. Thank you, Mr. Presvidia. Thank you, Thea. So I have myself in the queue. So I'll just ask one of my questions and then open it up, see if my other colleagues have some questions. So one of the things that we have, and I think to a degree, Trevor already talked about this, but one of the things that we've talked about on the Assembly in our discussions has been the idea of prevention and funding prevention and the need to fund crisis and striking the balance between the two. It just based on the funding framework that the coalition provided, your recommendation is that there should be equal shares of prevention and funding today, sort of crisis response. Could you just touch on a little bit more why we should do that versus focusing on the issues that we have before us today, which are, they are glaring. Folks in the community are seeing them. They're upset about. That's what we hear about the most often, is the issues that people see in front of them today. So would love to get perspective on that.
This is Tiffany. I'll just make a very brief answer to that question. But basically, if we only fund the things that people are seeing actively today and just continue to like put a Band-Aid on it or address the like actively dripping leak in the pipe, then we'll just always have to keep doing that, and we'll always have to create more and more shelter or treatment or services for folks after they have been abused. Whereas if we put money upstream and try to reduce risk factors at the very beginning and increase protective factors at the very beginning, then we'll see less of a need for the downstream issue. And so that's also why we don't tell you to put all of it upstream, because we know that you have a public that you are serving and that they want to see solutions at this downstream today level. But we're just not going to ever get anywhere if we don't also address the upstream and try to fix some of these problems before they start to reduce the demand for these services. And I guess that's also just to make another point about the critical need to fund dismantling systemic racism, because there are race-based disparities in every single one of these issues. I mean, like that's not because, that is because of our systems. That's not because of a culture or actions by those individuals. That is because the way the system is built. And so it's also why we have to specifically fund dismantling racism to help people who are most impacted by these harms and these ills, so that, again, we can reduce the demand later on in life. And that is forward thinking, and it's really challenging to show those results right away, and it requires some patience, but that is how we are going to make substantive change in our community.
This is Trevor, if I can just add to that, spot on, Tiffany. One of the also things to remember is not everything is visible. I think a lot of people are just talking about our homeless camps and so forth. That is a very small population of the homeless compared to families that are homeless. They're couch surfing. Those parents are off working and don't have time to be on the streets to hold up a sign asking for help and or to even reach out to you all. There's a majority of single adults who are also working and are homeless or always on the verge of homeless. There's kids throughout Anchorage that their families are under major stress, which increases their risk of preventionally being part of the system of OCS, because those stressors lead to, those social determinants then lead to actual child abuse and neglect. You don't get to see them until that abuse happens. And even then, as assembly members, you don't even see those numbers. OCS doesn't report to you, and I don't think they're even connected to your health department. So there are all these invisible folks that are in need of your support. And us as experts in the field that know the data, know these numbers, we're trying to make them visible to you. We're pointing out not only the pipes that have bursted, but those that are leaking and those that had the corrosion. And that is how we've outlined. And that's how I would approach any public, going, there are things that you are not seeing. And then it is our job with you to help people see those individuals and why these investments today are so important.
Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. I'm very much in alignment with what you've stated, and Natasha Pineda, I don't know if she is here, but director of the Anchorage Health Department, at least I think still the director, she also advocated quite strongly for increased prevention dollars, and she was actually very glad if we would even get to 20% prevention dollars. But I think what you're advocating for sounds logical, sounds right. So we'll see how that goes in the process. Mr. Weddleton.
Felix, through the chair, can I just say one thing to that? This is Trevor.
Sure.
I want everybody on the assembly to know that this is the concept of investing in prevention is not something that we dreamed up. This is based in research after research after research. There's long literature review that you can see. And also, if you actually look back 30, 40 years ago, when we actually did invest at a higher percentage in prevention, that we didn't have all these other tertiary issues that were going on. There's a reason that we're seeing more issues with kids when we have seen our state budget overall investment in kids take a nosedive. We've done the analysis of the state budget. There are correlations to all of these things. History shows us what success we can have in prevention over the long run, as well as research after research. So do know this isn't something that we think will work or hope will work. Research actually shows it will work. We just have to be willing to invest and give it time to work.
Thank you. Mr. Weddleton.
Thanks. I appreciate the idea of doing prevention, and kind of my concept in this alcohol tax is that would be the main focus of it, that we would do something very different than what we've been doing, which clearly hasn't been working very well. So a 50-50 split seems okay, because we do have to deal with what's in front of us right now, but boy, I wouldn't mind it going heavier to prevention. One thing when I look at this, and if we are to come out and say, unveil this is the big unveiling, what we're doing with the alcohol tax, a theory of change? The answer is no, right out the gate. People don't want theory. So the moniker probably means a lot to people who are in the business. To the average person on the street, it's like, I don't know what you're talking about, but I don't like that name. So I'd love to have a different name. And then starting right down, dismantle systematic racism. The strong case has been made that is one of those root problems. But when it's the first thing on there, I go, I didn't see that on the ballot measure. Where did that come from? It's the first thing we see is an odd name, and then this, and I'm going, you're losing me quick, or losing, I think, the average person. I've heard the stories enough, I can put it together. But I would say, if this is the way we're going, put that dismantle systematic racism as a subcategory of each of these categories. And I would put way at the top kind of the things that people are most hearing we're going to do, which is probably not the prevention. That's access to safe housing and recovery. And this whole thing with buying those buildings, where are you going to pay for it? We got alcohol tax money. And but it's kind of the packaging of this. It's going to lose things for us in a hurry. I would put it in probably less glorious, dramatic phrasing, I think. Anyway, little editorial comment. Thanks.
This is Tiffany. Felix, do you mind if I just say something about that?
Yeah, go ahead.
Thanks so much. Through the chair, I appreciate those comments, John, and we've been talking a lot about how to frame this. And one thing that I guess maybe I just need clarity around is that, in my mind, this document isn't to try to win over the public. It's to try to help. It's to make these recommendations to you, the assembly, because you all will be the ones deciding this money. And I'm happy to work with you and alter it, but I think we're also maybe just thinking you can take a look at this framework and look at the work that you all have already done in your frameworks and see how they can be combined. So just to say, I don't really anticipate us this exact specific one going in front of the public with us trying to defend it there. And just also throughout this conversation, I just want to recognize we have a lot of our other partners on this meeting as well. And so I know that we have been fielding some of these questions, but I also just want to say that there's a lot of expertise on the phone right now. And so I don't know what the appropriate way to do it is, but just to say there are other folks on the phone as well who have been teaching me throughout this process and can probably teach all of us some things.
Weddleton or Tiffany, yeah, appreciate that. I was kind of speaking to, I mean, you can label it however you want, and it's fine. But I would just hate to have an ordinance come forward that it says, and the assembly supports a theory of change, and that's going to turn heads. So amongst ourselves, we need a better title. Thanks. Different title.
Thanks, Mr. Weddleton. And I guess to the rest of the folks on the call, part of the coalition, feel free if you want to engage in the conversation. I think it would be most helpful if you just put yourself in the chat, just so I know that you want to engage, or feel free to just interrupt and speak up, and I can acknowledge you that way as well, whichever you are more comfortable with. So not hearing anything else on that point, I'll go ahead and turn it over to, sure, go ahead, Ms. Hodggrad.
Hi, I actually wasn't prepared to talk until I heard Mr. Weldington, John, and his comment about putting the dismantling racism somewhere underneath or behind, or, you know, somewhere less visible. And I just have to echo what has been already shared, that unless we can identify that racism is a factor in every component piece, you know, then we're going to stay where we are. There's not going to be that change that we so desperately need. I think, as Tiffany shared, the reason that it's right there, smack in the center, is for visibility for you all, for you as assembly members to keep in mind through that racial lens, that as we continue to allocate funding, we have to keep in mind that we are dealing with systemic racism. And so, you know, I'm a little frustrated myself. And when I hear comments like that, because I know how important it is when it comes to allocating funding for organizations, for businesses that don't necessarily receive the funding, for projects that are so worthy that will help move us along. And so, as a community, as one people united in building that beloved community. And so I know as Thea and Tiffany shared that we do have individuals on the line, and I'd like to, Felix, through the chair, see if we can get Shanae Williams to share right now about Shiloh Housing, another well-worthy program that benefits individuals that, you know, need a place to live, homeless individuals. A great program that has been in this community for decades, that, you know, need funding as well to sustain their program. And so, Shanae.
Thanks. Before I go to you, Shanae, I just want to clarify one thing. So I'm going to be keeping two queues. One queue for basically finishing up a thread, and then the second queue for any new topics. So I have Mr. Perez-Verdia for new topics, and then I have Shanae, John, and IU to finish up this thread that we're on. So Shanae, go ahead.
Mike, can you hear me? My phone says it's unmuting.
We can hear you.
Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. My name is Delmonicia Shanae Williams. I am the Executive Director of Shiloh Community Housing. And I was taken aback by the statement made about being that systemic racism not be in the forefront. I agree with Celeste. I agree with what she said. You have to understand that it's embedded in every situation that we're talking about and trying to address. It's embedded in each one of those situations. Shiloh Community Housing has been in existence since 2002. We bought our first property in 2004, and then we bought the transitional housing property that we're currently operating for homeless young adults 18 to 24. We have not received funding in support of our program that is equitable to all the other funding. We have not, but we have been able to continue our success in providing transitional housing to that population. We talked a little bit about invisible. This population is known as invisible around the world. That age group, you don't see them on the street. You don't see them hanging out at bars. And where do they come from? They're fleeing abusive families. So they don't have the skills. They're aging out of foster care. We're not a shelter. So we're providing a service, and I've been told it's a service that's not available throughout the community. So we are not a shelter. We provide transitional housing along with services, life skill training to get that population, empower that population to become productive citizens. But for some reason, we are not getting the access to funds to help us. At capacity, we can assist 14 young adults. We know that need is higher. I've been the executive director. This is my second go round. I was instrumental in starting the organization back in 2000, and not a whole lot has happened since then. We have been able to purchase one housing unit, but we need many more. And because we are a small organization, we are intentional about having direct and constant interactions with our program participants. So we've had a number of success with the program, but as you can expect, we're small, so success is small. So we're needing funding to help us move along in our capacity to continue to do that for the community.
Thank you. Mr. Whittleton?
Okay, hoping I don't dig myself into a deeper hole here. I certainly hope it wasn't taken that the phrase dismantle systematic racism would be taken off of this list. I think it's fine and important there. I think at the top, it doesn't line up with the ballot language, which would take people aback. But my suggestion, I think it's in line with what others have said, is add it to each of these subheadings. If it's supposed to be part of everything, make it part of everything. Under community safety, add that. Healthy families, prevention of violence, add it there. So I definitely hope it wasn't taken. I would say take that off. I think that is clearly important. Thanks.
Thanks. Ayu?
Yes. Thank you. Ayu Larunga. I am Ayu Kasatak, Vice President of First Alaskans Institute, calling in from Dagayakak, also known as Anchorage, on the traditional lands of the Dena'ina. Thank you for having me. I just wanted to maybe weave together a little bit of what has already been shared on this call to hopefully provide a little bit more context of our conversations and what led to the way that you see systemic racism and structural racism showing up in the plan. I think that this call and the conversations that I've been privy to prior to this really just demonstrate how important it is that we build both a shared understanding, a re-education of our history, as well as building shared language to understand what it is that we're talking about. I heard, folks talking about the crisis issues as something that's happening downstream. And I think that an important part of this process is understanding that crisis was manufactured generations ago, and it continues to manifest today. And the more that we can kind of tease apart and better understand contextually how history shows up today, I think the closer we'll be to even having the same conversation. Part of what makes me think of this is that so often the terms equality and equity get conflated as though they mean the same thing. But importantly, equality, which on its face seems like what it is that we should be striving for, where all people are created equally, does not account for the fact that historically we have not been treated equally, and those disparities continue to show up in the crisis rates that we see today. To speak a little bit more to that, just on a very fundamental level, this country was founded on stolen indigenous lands, on the backs of stolen African peoples. And law and policy was built to continue to oppress, suppress, and deny the rights of Indigenous, Black, and peoples of color, while supporting and creating opportunity for white Americans. And those laws and policies, and there are so many examples, some of which include the rights and access to voting, so choosing the people who are making these decisions for us in our country, the opportunity to purchase land, the opportunity to purchase property, practices such as redlining, which created opportunity for white families to become homeowners and begin a process of building generational wealth that their children and children's children and so on continue to benefit from today through the accumulation of generational wealth. A way that I've heard that described is with the game of Monopoly. So Monopoly was created, for instance, to throw another metaphor into this pot, Monopoly was created by and for the success of white people in this country, the founding fathers, as it were. And only after much fight, generations of fighting, did other people, including Black Americans, Indigenous Americans, etc., be allowed the opportunity to join in this game, this capitalistic game of Monopoly, to also have opportunity and generational wealth begin building. But what happens when you join a game of Monopoly after others have been playing it for a while? Right? So you can start to understand how generations of issues continue to show up today. That's just in the opportunity to access generational wealth and those kinds of things. On the flip side of that, in the suppression and denial of our inherent rights as Americans and as humans, quite frankly, in the denial of those rights, a lot of harms have been committed and continue to be committed. That's what most people see as racism, is the things that is very visible, the interpersonal racism that you see. And it's harder to understand structural racism because of that. So just really briefly, I would encourage folks on this call, if you're interested in actually reading the article, Dr. E.J. David, who is a treasurer in this town, has written an article. If you Google E.J. David, equality versus equity, he gives a really wonderful breakdown of how those two terms are actually quite different. So you may have seen the image where you have a very short person, a medium person, and a taller person behind a fence, and they can't see the ball game. And they say, you know, equality means you give each of them the same height stool. And so you've got the tall person can see even more of the field. The medium person can now see over the fence, and maybe the short person can. That's an equality approach. Everybody gets the same thing regardless of what you need. Whereas an equity approach gives the shortest person a higher stool so that they can also see over the fence. Whereas the middle person doesn't need as high of a stool. And the one who was able to see over the fence in the first place doesn't need a stool at all. So that's an equity approach. So that's fairly basic kind of understanding of the difference between equality and equity. However, what Dr. E.J. David does in that article to further break it down is to understand that if you retool that image just a little bit, where you have 3 adults that are the same height, so it's not about age, and that's not the reason that you can't see over the fence, but if you have 3 adults who cannot see over this fence, you'll see that there is a white person who can see over the fence just fine. There is a white woman who is dug down just ever so slightly into the ground. And then there is a brown person who is dug down into the ground. And that is why they can't see over the fence. That imagery helps to visualize the fact that white women to some degree, but especially Black and brown people, have been disenfranchised. We have literally been dug into the ground through suppression, through oppression, through racism and policy and practice. So there's a reason that we are not able to see over the fence. It's not a neutral state that we're in. And if you take an equality approach and you give each of those people the same amount, the white man is now much higher above the fence. The white woman is above, and then the person of color is just barely made whole. That's an equality approach. That does not create space to right the wrongs and the injustice of what has happened to create that state in the first place. So I agree with the last comment that John made when he was clarifying and stating that he thinks that structural racism needs to be added to everything. And I think I would say that I'm in agreement of that. And I think that that's where our conversation had led to, is that we understand that these challenges that we're trying to overcome right now were created through issues of structural racism. And so therefore, tackling structural racism and re-educating the citizenry of our city is an important part of helping to overcome these issues generations later. So I'm sorry that was really long-winded, but I was hoping to tie together a few threads. I'm happy to share more if folks wish.
Great, thank you so much, Ayu. I'm not seeing anyone else in the queue for that thread. So we'll go ahead and move on. Does anyone have any new questions or topics that want to bring up? Any other questions from Assembly members? We have about 30 minutes left in this conversation.
Felix?
Is that you, Ms. LaFrance?
Yes, Ms. LaFrance.
Go ahead.
Sorry, I didn't get into the chat. I just actually have a question about the project prioritization list. And I believe this has already been covered. We've had different meetings. But if someone, one of the speakers would be willing to talk about the priority votes, and I understand to some degree the rankings of the projects from the matrix. There are a lot of costs that are to be determined. And how, I guess I'm not really sure, there are about 89 projects. In terms of prioritization in the categories, would someone be able to speak or talk through this and provide a little more structure to me on how to look at this ranking of projects?
Felix, this is Thea. I'm happy to respond to that.
Go ahead.
Great. So I think for me, the best way to answer that is to kind of go back to the logic model and to what we were talking about before. And that's also now just been really well explained by Ayu and Celeste and Shanae. Really, this is, if we are serious about achieving the outcomes that people voted on dedicating this funding for, this is a big initiative that we're all committing to as a community. And it's going to take a pretty robust, pretty long-term effort to achieve those outcomes. So what we tried to do in this very short period of time is to draw from all of the folks that we could pull together. First, what they think are those activities that need to happen, but then what does that really look like in terms of projects that could be funded? So when you look at the long list of projects, that's what you're seeing is mostly what we're trying to communicate to you there is that there are a lot of people in our community who are skilled, who have the knowledge, who have the community connections, and who know what needs to be done to accomplish these pretty complicated and difficult things that are to be addressed by this alcohol tax money. So when you're looking at that long list of projects, you're seeing the list of things that our community members are ready and prepared to do. So what does it take to get from that to actual activities happening on the ground? That goes back to what it means to be managing this whole initiative. It means some entity has to be invested, both the authority and the capacity. There has to be enough staff and infrastructure in place to manage these funds. So not just getting them out the door, but then also tracking to make sure that those funds are producing the results that we're all committing to here. And if not, changing how that gets allocated. And so I think you've also seen in our documents, and I think again you've heard it today, that it's not just getting money out, it's how you give it out. It's who is given the power to make change through the investment of those funds. And again, and when we talk about systemic racism, that's a type of thing we're talking about. When you hear Celeste say, we have these projects ready to go, but we don't often get the funding to do them. That speaks to, who is in the network to know when there's a grant coming out, who's got the organization with the relationship to make it happen. So I think it is a little bit overwhelming, and I'm sorry for that, to see this long list of projects, but I think really what it's trying to communicate to you is two main things. One, that there's people ready to do this work, and two, that it's going to take a transparent and well-managed process to make this money turn into the positive community changes that the voters voted for and that we all collectively want to see. And so just the ranking, I guess I wouldn't get too hung up on the ranking because this was a pretty quick process. And, we weren't trying to take votes necessarily. It kind of depended on who might have seen the emails. But I think mostly what we wanted to show you is that there are lots of very worthy organizations, individuals, and projects ready to go to do the work that's in the theory of change. And I'm sure other people could add to what I just said. So I'll stop there.
This is Trevor. We also, in the spirit of the work that we did, we didn't want to come as majority of white individuals that are already key organizations to bring all these people together, talk about diversity and making sure and looking at process, and then ignore that and just make our recommendations. That would not be true to the philosophy of the theory of change or to the philosophy and trust that were created of bringing everybody together. What we encourage the assembly to do is use the theory of change to create the buckets of money, and then it's outlined in that theory how you bring community members together, both with lived experience, making sure there's diversity as well as expertise, to then do the RFP process to determine which is the best investments versus just people having a short amount of time to pitch what they think, because we know there's still people missing from that list. But if we create a more equitable process, not only are we addressing that first thing in that theory of change, but the likelihood of having better and stronger programs that are achieving exactly what the voters want and what we all want for the community is even much higher and stronger.
Great. Thanks so much, Thea. Thanks so much, Trevor. Did you have anything else, Suzanne?
I'm good, Felix. Or thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Lafritz. Mr. Perez-Verdia.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I'm having a process. I'm kind of a process person, so I'm having a bit of a process challenge. I feel like we're having multiple conversations, and I wanted to just kind of take a step back for a second. So I appreciated earlier that I heard that the intention was that your group and the work that you did was intended to be kind of internal, and that you were giving it to us as recommendation from all the people and all the organizations, and then we were to take that and then use that in our process to develop our priorities. And that was helpful to understand, because I was walking into this meeting thinking we collaboratively are working through a process to develop the priorities. And so having me understand that that wasn't your intention. Your intention wasn't to work with us collaboratively to come up with the priorities, but for you to make a recommendation to us, and then we take that information and make a decision based on that. So that was one piece that was helpful. But I guess in that vein, I'm curious to understand, for instance, in your process, how you, or did you, for instance, for the town halls that we did you incorporate, public comment, general public comment, and general public concerns or ideas into your work? And did you get information from the different departments within the municipality in terms of their recommendations about what should be done or what priorities should be? And was that incorporated into it? Because in our process, we're doing that, right? We're going to the different departments and trying to get their recommendations. So I guess what I'm trying to figure out is how we use this, because if it's really you've delivered this package to us and given us a lot of information and given us kind of the rationale and the information behind it, and then you go away and then we work with that to put other pieces to it to develop something, then that works for me. But I'm just trying to figure out sort of a process of where this fits into our process. And that's why when some of the members were talking about how we present this to the public, and thinking about the wording and the structure and those kinds of things, I think there was an assumption that this would be presented to the public as our framework. So I guess I'm wondering, both from our chair and from leaders of this group, really trying to understand what the expectation is in terms of how we use this, and whether I'm correct in saying that the intention is to just sort of like deliver this to us and saying, here you go, now you guys do with it what you will in your process, or whether there's an expectation to continue to collaborate with you and others as we move forward.
Thanks for the question. So I think Tiffany's can answer probably 95% of that question, and then I'll chime in after.
Thanks.
Thanks very much. And I understand that there's some confusion around process. So just to say, we started this work not at the request of the Assembly, but at the request of some organizations in the public who knew that there was a process happening, who didn't really know how to get involved with the Assembly's process, and who wanted to weigh in. And so we sent our first email about this work on June 19th and pulled together 6 meetings in about 4 weeks, trying to reach out to as many people as we could. And we started with folks who we had already been working with on the campaign to pass the alcohol tax. And we included some other folks who we knew were working in the kind of bucket areas. And then we also tried really hard to reach out to diverse voices, people who are doing equity work in the community, and people with lived experience. And we asked all of them to invite their friends. I know that we invited at least some municipal departments, but I doubt that we invited all of them. But I know that some of them did participate either in the meetings or through email response or phone calls with us afterward. But just kind of to say that our intent was to help inform the assembly, not to replace your process. We know that you all have your own process that was outlined in that really great resolution that was passed the night the ordinance went on the ballot for the alcohol tax that talks about including subject matter experts. We just also know that, I mean, this is a lot for us to try to pull together, and that maybe you didn't have capacity given all of the other things you've been working on. So for the way that we have talked about it is that this is just we would love to collaborate with you and to have dialogue to figure out how ours can combine with yours, but we really just was trying to help inform the assembly.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, can I ask a follow-up?
Sure, and then I'm happy to provide my response as well. So go ahead, Mr. Presvidia.
Why don't you go ahead and respond first, and then I'll ask a question.
Okay. Yeah, so yeah, my response will be brief. And first, just want to thank Recover Alaska and the Community Coalition for all of this work. I think it's really been additive to the process that we outlined, and that began with that resolution that was passed in January. So for my part, like I stated in an email last week and then reaffirmed in an email this week to the body, I'm trying to squeeze in as many of these meetings as possible by the end of the month so that we can continue having these dialogues and continue engaging with our community partners who have done a lot of this work. And so that in September, now it's our turn to really get to work, because we've had all of these committee meetings, we've reviewed all of these proposals, and now we have to figure out, how do we put all of these things together, and how do we bring forward a package to present to the community? And so, as I've stated, the intent is at the end of August, we're done with all of these meetings, and then September, we really go into high gear. Mr. Presvidia, go ahead.
Okay, so I really appreciate this. So if I were to lay this out, that this is a representation primarily of community partners and experts who work and have lived experience in the areas that we're talking about. So if we were to think about a chart of making sure that we're hitting all the different areas so that this is a well-informed proposal, and we were to say, okay, one box is the municipality itself, like the departments, the people who are actually going to be delivering the work, that sort of thing. That's one box. There's community partners, there's experts, there's the general public. So we've checked off with this a lot of community partners, a lot of people with lived experience, and a lot of people who have sort of expert knowledge in these areas. But this does not necessarily represent what the departments of the municipality want, and this does not necessarily represent sort of the broad community voice in terms of the general public. And that's we need to and we have been doing that work as well. So once we take those different buckets, if you will, and put them all together, then that's how we develop our final product. That's kind of what I'm interpreting here. And so if that's not correct me, but that's helpful in me understanding the process and how this work helps to inform that process and that final product. Mr. Chair, does that sound correct to you?
I think what you have stated is correct. And yeah, we had those town halls earlier in the month. We will continue to engage with the public. I think, the intent is to have 2 public hearings on whatever sort of program we put out for the public to consider. So, and then of course in September, most of our community councils kick off again. So I expect most members will be talking with their community councils about everything. So yeah, I think there's going to be a lot of continued sort of a public writ large engagement throughout the September and through November. With that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to April.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is April Kyle, Interim CEO at South Central Foundation. And I was just thinking about the question asked around process and the long list of initiatives, and I wanted to just share the framing in my head. I think that there are some parts of the list of priorities that fortunately have other funding sources that could fund sustainability if launch money were applied. And that's not necessarily true of everything on the list, and certainly doesn't mean that those would be the priority, but for things like treatment and recovery innovation, treatment operations, and crisis services, there's an opportunity to use this alcohol tax money to launch a new program where the provider who has put together the business plan sees the ability to have some level of sustainability with the assistance of initial launch money. And I'm hoping I can say this quickly in a way that makes sense. But if you think about carving out some of this money for those program launches, then that means that you could, launch a program this year and dedicate launch money to that program, and then see it as a new thing in our community over time, but then reapply that launch money in a later year towards launching another program, and again, and again, and again. And, my world is most closely tied to treatment services and crisis services and behavioral health as it relates to this conversation. And a lot of those services with the 1115 waiver have the potential to be sustainable in the long run, but the problem is there's quite a bit of upfront investment to kick a program like that off. And so part of why I'm sharing that is it would be one thing to say, here are the programs we want to launch, and it's a finite and decided list. It would be another thing to say, we want to use some of these dollars to launch new things that are sustainable after launch. And our work now is not to decide them, but rather to decide the process by which they're chosen each year, where we look at sort of what our community needs are, what voices are needed to be brought to the table in order to inform those community needs. So that inclusive voice process that others have spoken to. And then to really see kind of new program launches annually reusing the same portion of that potential $12 million. So I'm just sharing that as an example about the difference between a list that's decided and kind of a process that happens year after year. So I hope that is maybe a helpful comment. Thank you.
Thank you. Thea?
Thank you. And I think my comment follows from what April just shared, and also just to continue to kind of answer Cameron's question. I think the type of strategy that April just described in terms of how to use funding in the arena of health and human services, which is really what this funding is allocated towards, is, there's expertise that can help us do that really well. And so I think, again, what we've tried to do with this collaboration is bring together people in our community who have expertise in these areas. And that includes people who have lived experience and who are directly part of communities that are most impacted by these issues that the alcohol tax seeks to address. And so I guess in terms of Cameron's question about the status of the result of this work, I would hope that you would see it as the kind of expert input into a process that you would use with other types of problems. For example, if our communities decided we really would need to reduce the number of heart attacks, or at least reduce the number of people who die from heart attacks, you would take public testimony generally, but probably you would ask people like cardiologists and nutritionists, and they would be the ones who would actually help impart the strategy to you that you would invest in to make it work. And so I guess I'm just trying to say that I think the body of work that this collaboration has pulled together needs to be seen in that, with that status. This is a kind of expert opinion on how to go about addressing these community issues that people voted to address. And I think so part of that is also gets back to how do we do it? Because how we do it, like April just said, really changes, how much we can invest in and what the impact of that is going to be. And I think another piece of it, and it's also I'm kind of tracking back to the question about how do we make sure addressing systemic racism and decolonization is part of this work. We need to embed that in the structure that is managing these funds. And so I know there's a proposal for an Office of Equity and Justice. I think that is something that this group, I believe is probably, that's a worthy proposal to really consider. And I think it can't just be one person, right? It's got to be embedded in the systems and structures of the municipalities. So we know the health department needs resources to be able to perform these functions. And to have, for example, someone who's a health equity expert embedded in that department as well, could really start to really embed this type of work in how we manage our community, how we fund it, how we address our health issues, and just really make a huge step forward in terms of being a healthier place for all of us. So I just want to I think the question about process is also just, it's not just for now and how you make your decision, but it's for how you move forward with spending this money over time.
Thank you. Any other thoughts on this thread before I see if there's any other topics? Okay, not seeing anything. We have about a little less than 10 minutes left. Any other additional topics folks want to bring up? Any other questions or thoughts from Assembly members? All right, not hearing anything.
Wait, last second unmute.
Okay, got it. So I'm gonna go ahead and go Mr. Weddleton, then Jasmine, then Anna. So go ahead, Mr. Weddleton.
Okay, just brief, I have taken the advice of this group the way, Theanol said. It is absolutely amazing that such a good group got together so quickly to come up with these suggestions. And if everything we dealt with have that kind of citizen involvement, boy, there'd be no stopping us. Thanks.
Thank you. Jasmine, go ahead.
Thank you, Chair Rivera and the Assembly. I was just hoping to take us back to the beginning when both Recover Alaska and the Children's Trust were able to share some ideas on how this all connects and this notion of prevention. So I think most folks on the line know that the Homeless Coalition, my organization, worked for almost 2 years on a gap analysis. And I think one question that I get one-on-one is, how does that gap analysis fit in with this body of work? And I think that example may be helpful to the Assembly. My organization's work, which was done in partnership with several of the organizations leading this body of work, was really about looking at an existing system for the first time to identify gaps in what already is happening. And I've been pretty transparent that what's missing in that body of work are innovations, creativity, a more deep and representative voice from affinity groups, advocacy partners, and people with lived experience. Because frankly, it was a very uphill battle just to get the work done with the existing system. It doesn't really allow, especially in early years for community needs assessment type bodies of work, to bring all partners to the table in a really inclusive way. So where I got very excited about this work in regards to homelessness, which of course is our lane in this conversation, is that there was innovation. There were those affinity and advocacy groups present to share information about equity and lack thereof. And I think it allows us to have an extra piece of the puzzle at the table. So it's not just me in the middle with system thinking, but people who are on the fringe of that and haven't been able to access that. I heard Shanae speak earlier in regards to Shiloh. Great example of an excellent homeless services and housing provider that hasn't always been welcomed at the same level as other organizations at the table. And so I think when I look at this, this is a piece that applies. And frankly, again, to go back to what Trevor and folks were sharing earlier, I came to homeless services because I did child welfare work. And when my children were failed, they ended up as adults that were homeless on the streets and in tremendous trauma, often with addiction and all sorts of assaults in their history. I do this work because of the kids. So I'll be the first to say, I think what excites me about this conversation and the Assembly's level of gravity and respect for this conversation is also that I will never, ever, ever end homelessness if we don't stop domestic violence, child abuse, and the other items that are part of what the alcohol tax envisions. And so I think it's really exciting that we're having a conversation, not trying to further silo and segment our work, but really recognizing that the work of child abuse prevention is the work to end homelessness. The work of domestic violence prevention is the work to end homelessness. And frankly, it serves a wider audience because if we're getting to people early on, not only do we know that it's incredibly cost effective and we will save the community money, but we also know that we're getting to people that are still in homes. We're getting to kids that are still in school. We're getting to moms and girlfriends and partners who are still in a home that maybe they could stay in if we get them the right help. So I do want to say on behalf of the homeless side of this work, we got to work together. And I think this is the first time various organizations have been brought into the messy space to say, how do we work together? And yeah, we don't have an exact set of numbers and an exact plan, but I really do think it's an innovation in and of itself to have the space created to have the messy conversation that, you know, IU recently said to me, and it's just been sitting deeply with me, that a rising tide lifts all boats. So I think about this notion of this is a kind of the first wave of that rising tide at a time that our community tremendously needs partnership and collaboration. So I'm always happy and available to talk about how homelessness fits in and kind of how my system work fits in with this vision for the future. But I hope that at least helps to address kind of the messiness of how does this fit in with everybody else's kind of siloed work.
Thank you. Anna.
Thanks. This is Anna Brawley, and as you all know, I've been involved, although usually not the person speaking out front. But I just wanted to briefly respond to something that Mr. Perez-Verdia had said, which is engaging the general public. And I just wanted to emphasize that that as we know, especially in a small community like ours, and I know we're the largest community in Anchorage, but it is small. And we all know that, that we're all the public, we're all members of the community. And so I've observed in a lot of the public comment over the last several weeks and before that, there's an artificial distinction that's made between people that do something for a living and people who are volunteers, or people who, you know, it's part of their job, or they're associated with an organization versus not being associated with an organization, or somebody who shows up and identifies in it as an individual versus part of a group. And I think that really is an artificial distinction. So I just want to, again, emphasize that we're all the public. And so I would hope that this is seen not only, as Thea said, as you know, experts with various definitions of that word, but also just that this is the community speaking. And I think that you've heard many similar things, maybe not even coordinated with our group this summer, about people wanting to care for their neighbors, people wanting to see wellness and well-being in the entire community, and people really, I think, ready to address this. So I just, again, wanted to emphasize that. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Anna. I think with that, I'm going to go ahead and wrap this up. Really want to thank Recover Alaska, Alaska Children's Trusts, Alaska Black Caucus, and all of the other great organizations that are here representing your various expertise, constituencies, and the public. This has been a wonderful process so far, and it's really, like I said earlier, been additive to all of the work that the Assembly has been engaging in since May, thinking about the alcohol tax and how we can do the most good that we can with the funds that we will begin receiving next year. So thanks everyone for this engagement. It's been wonderful, and have a great rest of your day. This work session is adjourned.
Thank you.